Parallel. Try as he might, he could not stop himself from looking at the window. When he'd first sat down to read, the sun had been setting, lending a buttery warmth to the wicker chair in the corner of the room beneath the window. It had seemed so homely and cosy, he'd been unable to resist taking out his book and settling in. The scent of his cocoa curled drowsily around him, swaddled as he was in the blanket he had taken from the end of the bed. He did not know what it was that had woken him. Some tiny sound, perhaps, an incongruity in the air, a mouthless breath stirring the hairs on the back of his neck. But once he had crept to wakefulness, his book limp in his hand, the window held his full attention. It was dark now, and across the valley dim lights from other homes glinted yellow, hinting at the warmth within. In this room, though, it was as cold as the grave. He wanted to rise, to check the lock on the window he was sure he had latched. Yes, he could see the hasp of it in place, limed in a sliver of silver moonlight. The window was shut just as he remembered. And yet, here was a whisper, the suggestion of movement. He held his breath, the sound of his own heart beating loud and unsteady in his breast. His mouth went dry. The room was still, close, expectant, like the pregnant pause before a summer storm. And then it came. The whisper of the curtain as it trailed, dreamlike, across the peeling paint of the windowsill. And then softly, silkily, along the skin of his arm. His flesh tightened at the icy touch as the lace made contact with every raised hair. His eyes widened, his breath came in gasps, but he could no more move than tear his gaze from that delicate drapery as it wafted gently in a breeze that was not there. Again it touched his arm, grazing the skin. A shiver spasmed through his body. The curtain stilled. Particle by particle, the room regained its sense of normalcy. The sounds of the house, the ordinary creaks and groans of plumbing and heating, began to filter back into his consciousness. His limbs felt strangely heavy, as if he'd run a great distance. As soon as he was able, he fled the room. Breathing hard, he steadied himself against the bathroom counter. The porcelain sink was cool and solid under his trembling hands, bolstering his frayed nerves. He did not dare look into the mirror. It took him some time to come back to himself, caught as he was in a strange kind of unreality. Slowly, by increments, he talked himself into returning to his room, though his bare feet were hesitant on the hall carpet. Again, that feeling of unreality stole over him. The room looked just as it should, the bed untouched, the suitcase open, his shoes by the door. The blanket and his book had fallen to the floor as he had sprung out of the chair. Each object, each item had been rendered strange by fear. It had not looked so strange in daylight, he thought. It must have been a dream. It must have been a dream. He rubbed his arm, still puckered up with goosebumps. Must have been. Though he thought he should, he could not make himself get into the bed. Somehow it no longer seemed as if it was his. Instead, he dressed quickly, out of the gaze of the window. He could not bear to draw the curtain. With everything packed, he bent to retrieve his book, but when his eyes fell on the cover, the book was not his own. He stared at it. The book was not his own. His had been a pulpy train station paperback, a Penguin classic, but one of those light-papered creations that one accumulates when travelling. This, however, was a cloth-bound volume in cream and pale green with gold paper ends and, when he checked, marbled end papers. A murder mystery. He checked the publication date, 1938. On the title page, someone had inscribed in gorgeous copper plate, "For Cecily," and the date, the 16th of March, 1939. There was something pressed between the pages. He allowed the book to fall open. Tucked safely inside was a spray of tiny flowers, little puffs of petals on thin branches. There was the suggestion of white in the petals, Gypsophilia, perhaps. Gingerly holding up the stem to the light, he wondered at it. He'd been using a leaf as a bookmark. He'd picked it up outside the church the day before, part of the first fall of the autumn. Now he wondered who might find it. All at once the impression came to mind of a woman in a cotton print dress, twirling the large red leaf, a puzzled expression on her face. For a moment it felt as if he could really see her there beside the window. He could almost reach out and touch her. Then their eyes met, widened, and she was gone. He waited, feeling his heart jump about in his chest, but the room was quiet. There was no woman, no strange movement of the curtains, no leaf. Just a book that was not his own, and a sprig of dried flowers in his hand.
Quillian stood under the eaves of the famous glass forest of Vidiri and gazed curiously up at the crystalline branches above her. She reached out and ran a finger along one of them, which hummed under her touch. The high, sweet, vicious sound made her skin crawl, and she hastily snatched her hand back, wiping it on her trousers, feeling as if she had touched something slimy and polluted. "Oi, girl!" The peremptory shout came from deeper in the unnatural forest, and Quillian sighed, hefting her knapsack into a more comfortable position and stepping obediently forwards into the eerily shifting half-light. When the colourful rogue Salomon Thane had passed through her village 3 short weeks ago, it had seemed like the answer to a prayer. In exchange for her assistance on the road, he had offered her food, lodging, and a longed-for opportunity for travel and adventure. It had not taken her long to realise that his flamboyant manner concealed a heart of flint, a complete lack of morals, and a decidedly unstable temper. The promised food and lodging more often than not consisted of stale crusts and sleeping in the open, and while there had certainly been plenty of travel, adventure had been decidedly lacking. Quillian had made up her mind to strike out on her own days ago, but the lure of a trip to fabled Vidiri had proved too much to resist. She could only hope that she didn't live to regret it. Several days later, Quillian was very much regretting it. Wondrous though it was, Vidiri was also cloaked in malevolence, and she felt very small and alone in the middle of what felt like endless miles of hostile trees. The forest's splintered and distorted light made it impossible to focus on anything properly, filling the air with shifting, roiling shadows that vanished as soon as she turned her full attention on them. She had slept badly since passing under Vidiri's roof, afraid of waking to find herself trapped in a cage of icy roots or sealed in a glassy tomb. There was also Sullivan's increasingly strange behaviour to consider. He had maintained a bruising pace ever since they entered the wood, forging ahead with a feverish glitter in his eyes, and had barely said a word except to bark out the occasional order. A man who loved the sound of his own voice, and with a seemingly inexhaustible fund of stories gleaned from half a lifetime on the road, it was rare for him to go this long without holding forth on one subject or another. Lost in her own thoughts, Quillian failed to notice that Sullivan had suddenly stopped and walked straight into him. He didn't appear to notice, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Quillian followed his gaze and recoiled in horror. In the centre of a small clearing rose what must have been the oldest tree in all Vidiri, a great, gnarled, twisted monstrosity, with black ropes of decaying moss dripping from its branches. Its trunk was covered with a scabbed, vitreous crust that glistened sickly and seemed to ooze down towards where huge roots were sunk like claws into the ravaged earth. She caught at Sullivan's arm, tugging him round to face her. "Sullivan, please! This is wrong, can't you feel it? We need to leave, now!" He turned on her with a wordless snarl, fist raised and teeth bared. His eyes were black and blank and hard, all humanity rinsed from them, and replaced with a merciless and single-minded intent. Quillian stumbled backwards, tripping over a rock and falling heavily. Sullivan, or whatever now rode him, turned away and advanced on the tree. He ran his hands over the trunk, crooning madly under his breath, before pressing his palms flat against it. His hands disappeared into the tree, sinking easily up to the wrists as if passing through water. When he brought them out again, he was holding a huge grey-black object, the size of a human head. It looked dull and lifeless, its colour faded and its surface pitted and scarred. But even as Quillian watched, it seemed to squirm between Sullivan's hands and began to pulse horribly. Within a matter of minutes the object was dark and glossy, as if it had been filled with fresh ink, and the pulsing had become stronger and more regular. Sullivan turned back towards the tree, his movements as jerky, as disconnected as those of a puppet. But as he reached out towards it again, Quillian scrambled up and forwards in one ungraceful movement, connecting hard with the back of his legs and sending him sprawling. The black object was jarred loose from his grasp, and she snatched it up. It writhed in her hands, cutting into them painfully, but she smashed it hard against the rock until it was reduced to nothing but a handful of black glittering fragments. The forest screamed. From out of nowhere a wind arose, roaring through the trees like a great angry beast. The first leaf snapped loose with a sound like breaking ice and whirled off into the maelstrom, to be followed by another and yet another. As the air filled with them, dazzling and razor-sharp, Quillian turned and fled.
The end of everything. The time had come, God called me home, but I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay with Postman Pat and with Rupert Bear and Poe. I wanted to kiss my mummy's face and stroke my daddy's hair. I wanted to jump on my brother's bed. There wasn't the time to spare. Love knew no limits for me down on earth, from my family, my friends and my toys. There were earwigs and flowers and dancing and fun. There were music and laughter and noise. My time there among you was cut very short, but a lifetime of giggles you gave, and it moves me to see all my family and friends sat there crying and trying to be brave. For I never knew violence or hatred or pain. My world was filled only with love. So don't grieve for me now I am gone from your world. I am here in God's playground above. You will all hear my voice in the breeze through the trees. So remember me only with joy. For though lent to you only, I live in your hearts as your special, unique little boy. Thank you.
A Matchbox of Memories by Hannah Burns. Smile! Cheeks burned as she forced another smile. Another light flashed, leaving black dots dancing in front of weary eyes. One more! Came the cheery photographer's voice. You said that 10 minutes ago, Grandma grumbled, leaning heavily on her walking stick, pearls perfectly set against wrinkled skin. Come on, Vera, it'll be worth it, encouraged the elderly man next to her, his arm looped around her to take some of her weight, so she could stand up straighter. Vera grumbled good-naturedly as she straightened the charity shop dress she'd fixed up for today. My gorgeous dove, whispered George, kissing her cheek. The flash went off again. This time her smile was more genuine. That was so sweet, squealed one of the grandchildren. Or was it one of their friends? Vera looked at the child, her mind failing to pull up their name. Dark hair, dark eyes. Darcy? The child shook her head, puzzled. A lady behind her in her 40s smiled. No, Mum, I'm Darcy. You're pulling poor Daisy's leg, laughed the older woman who had the same dark hair and dark eyes. Vera forced herself to laugh. Yes, of course. George smiled sadly at the box in his hand, gazing at his wife through the small window. She was sitting neatly, hands trembling in her lap, wearing the same yellow dress she had mended for herself for the photos. It hung a little looser now. The string of pearls, still resting against her neck, were not so fitted. He took a breath and stepped in. Morning, my gorgeous dove. He always held his breath after saying this. Could today be the day? George! The breath released as he moved into the room. Today was a good day. She had remembered him. He sat opposite her and smiled, placing the box on the table and taking her shaking hands in his own. Together they opened the box. It held pictures taken that day, names written above each face. More pictures lined the wall, each with names and dates. On the door was a picture of Vera's nurse. How are you today? He asked with a smile, smoothing the hair back from her face. He thought perhaps she'd forgotten to brush her hair again. The nurse would be in later to do it. They were good people here. He had searched for a long time to find the best for his dove. I don't remember, she whispered, her hands tightening around his. She looked at him, tears lining her eyes. He kissed her cheek and gave her the box. We'll remember together.
When Martha bought the farmhouse in Fraser Valley, the real estate agent didn't tell her about the ghosts. That wasn't a surprise because that was not something that was usually disclosed when buying a house in this province, even if the house was over 150 years old. But still she was surprised when she first saw the phantoms hanging around at the bottom of the hill, where the forest started beyond the barn. It was not an area she had explored, and they might have been there all along, but it was only when she was looking for stray chickens that she noticed them. There seemed to be a group of them, and they didn't move from the area. They didn't come into the house. They didn't come into the barn. They didn't come into the garden. They just hovered as though waiting for something, but not knowing what. So one day she decided to investigate, and she pushed past, if you could really push past ghosts, to see what was in the grove. She found a path that led her deep into the earth, and there, though she thought it was rather odd, she followed it anyway until she came to the river Styx. The only reason that she knew it was the river Styx was because Sharon, the boatman, came over and started yelling at her for not being dead and telling her that she shouldn't be there, and of course he told her his name, as well as letting her know that this was indeed the river Styx. Martha knew Greek mythology from her years in school, but was puzzled why the entrance was in Fraser Valley, British Columbia, rather than, say, closer to Greece. But she reasoned that the entrance to the underworld could be just about anywhere, so accepted this. "I'll leave," she said, "but could you tell me why the ghosts are here and hanging around at the edge of the forest? Aren't you supposed to ferry them across to the afterlife?" Sharon gave her a long look and said, "They don't have coin." "Oh, you mean pennies?" she asked. "It could be pennies," he said. "Thank you," she said, and hurried back the way she had come to the world above. And that was when she began collecting pennies and turning them over to Sharon once a week so they could ferry all these poor ghosts over the river Styx. There were always more ghosts, and though the old ones left, new ones came all the time. It was all going well until one day the Canadian government decided to do away with the penny. She continued until there were no pennies left in circulation, and she went down to Sharon and offered him brass buttons instead. "The coins have changed again?" he asked. "Yes," she lied. "They redesigned the penny." He nodded as though understanding, and that was how Martha paid for the dead with brass buttons after all the pennies disappeared from Canada.
Amicus the Nomad by E. L. Tovey. The web is wide, but I met you. Of the millions, billions of people, of the trillions of terabytes, I met you, Amicus Carissimus. Honestly, at first, I thought you were a chap, a good, solid name like Amicus, a good, strong language like Latin. It's muscular, a good pseudonym. Was the first comment you ever sent to me. Thought I'd caused offence or some major blunder. I nearly stopped blogging altogether, until I thought, don't be such a wet blanket, Amelia. If I had stopped, I would never have met you. Over the days we chatted more, I learned you were a nomad, and I marvelled that you had so many brothers and sisters, such a big family, until I found out they were siblings of faith, and I felt really stupid. And then you told me you were a girl, and I realised I walk through life living on too many assumptions. You asked for my help as a linguist one day, and there was a small moment I might have said no. He said, "People use you, Amelia, because you always offer to help. You have so little time for you. Please say no." There was an ounce of a second when I might have said no, and I would never have met you. On the Koran we worked, but found friendship rather than answers together. My real name is Katie Coates, you said, and then I realised I'd never needed a name to consider you a friend. I envied your faith to know a God and to love a God and know he loves you in return. It must be a wonderful thing. Ironically, the very envy I felt was a sin, probably. And as we know, I tried. I asked questions. In the end, I realised we will just leave the door open and hope God wanders in. Until then, I will try to be the best person I can be. And digital to digital, our friendship formed, from blogsphere to email to messenger. Every morning in my inbox, I found a good morning or happy emoji. And every morning that message saw my smile. But I began to wonder, like he had said, whether one day there would not be a morning in my messages. I waited for that day, but thankfully he was wrong. The problem with a nomadic friend is they are never in one place. You cannot meet for coffee or book theatre tickets or picnic in the park. I wasn't sure I'd ever see my lovely friend in person. We might be stopping in Cheadle. You messaged me one day. Took me by surprise, thick with excitement. I could not contain myself. We were meeting for coffee. I left a little late, pacing into town, forgetting the way there is all uphill. I hated meeting people all sweaty and face red, especially for the first time. Then I turned a corner and saw you in real life. Katie! I screamed and threw my whole self around you. So pleased to meet my friend in person, so proud to meet my friend in person. I couldn't believe it. And I had a smile that wouldn't leave. And I forgot that I was uphill, sweaty and red in the face because my friend was here and we had met. I got home that night after meeting you, and he was home from work. I jumped into his arms and told him all about it, and he said he was so pleased I had my lovely nomad friend, because he knows the web is wide, but I met you. Of the millions, billions of people, of the trillions of terabytes, I met you, Katie.